What is up, Cryonics? Welcome to the off-road capability testing for the new Mammoth Patriot Mil-Spec. This off-road test is an update to my off-road capability testing series where I've tested the majority of off-road capable vehicles in GTA Online. I will leave the link to a playlist down below in the pinned comment where you will find all the other vehicles I've done already so that you can compare. Before we start, if you have any questions as to how each obstacle is scored, please refer to the tutorial video which is linked in the pinned comment. Also remember that the most updated spreadsheet with all of the off-road capability scores for vehicles I've tested so far will be linked in the pinned comment as well. So the Mil-Spec is pretty much a 4-door version of a Squatty, which was added about a year ago, or so it seems at first glance. They're actually very different when you park them side by side. The Mil-Spec is wider, it's lower, and it's a bit more torquey as well. The Squatty, on the other hand, is taller and more narrow, plus the Squatty is in the SUVs class, whereas the Mil-Spec is in the off-roads class. So they are very different vehicles. But anyways, the following points for each obstacle will be out of 10 possible points. The Mammoth Patriot Mil-Spec is fully customized, with the bumper and sidestep options that provide the most ground clearance, and it also has stock suspension as well. So, starting off with the incline test from a flat surface, the Mil-Spec is pretty average in terms of power and torque. It makes it past red block number 4, which gives it a 4 out of 10. In stage 2 of this test, where it started at an angled position, it just barely gets a 4 out of 10 as well, which again is pretty average. If we take both those scores, we get an average of 4 for the incline test. It just seems to lack the raw power and torque to go any higher. Next up we have the dirt incline test. It makes it to the top without any hesitation, which gives it a 10 out of 10. I've also climbed some mountains with it, and it does very well up steep inclines. That's definitely its biggest strength, but it's still not as good in comparison to the top vehicles like the trophy truck or the Camacho, for example. Dirt braking is very poor for the Mil-Spec. It reminds me a lot of the regular Mammoth Patriot, where the brakes are practically non-existent going downhill. It goes past all the markers at the bottom, which unfortunately gives it a 1 out of 10. Rock crawling for the Mil-Spec is pretty decent. Its ground clearance really isn't all that great in comparison to the Squatty, for example. Throughout 3 obstacles, it unfortunately bottoms out a total of 6 times, which gives it a 4 out of 10 for stage 1 of this test. In stage 2 of this test, which is subjectively scored, it has pretty much no hesitation for the first 2 obstacles, but it does struggle a bit for the last one, so I'm going to have to give it a 9 out of 10 for stage 2 of this test. If we take both those scores, we get an average of 7.5 out of 10 for the rock crawling test, which is a pretty decent score, but definitely not as good as the Squatty. Powertrain is honestly pretty average for the Mil-Spec. We see wheel spin from the driver's side rear wheel and the passenger side rear wheel as well, which gives it a 7 out of 10 for this test. Next up we have bumper clearance. Now the clearance on the Mil-Spec is great, as to be expected. It does not scrape at all, which gives it a 10 out of 10 for this test. Suspension travel is not too great. That's where both the Mil-Spec and the Squatty suffer, in my opinion, as they basically have the same suspension travel as the regular Mammoth Patriot. According to the markers, it gets a 6 out of 10. High-speed stability is pretty good, but not on the top level of most of the off-road vehicles, mainly due to the average suspension travel we talked about previously. It gets pretty unstable towards the end, which gives it an 8 out of 10. Next up we have deep water testing. For stage 1 of this test, it makes it to the end, which gives it a 10 out of 10. In stage 2 of this test, which is the deeper side, the Mil-Spec performs very similarly to the regular Patriot. It unfortunately doesn't have the amazing deep water capability that the Squatty was well known for in this deeper section. It dies right at red block number 8, which gives it an 8 out of 10 for this test. Now if we take both those scores, we get an average of 9 out of 10 for the deep water test. And finally, we have the dirt acceleration test. This path is exactly a quarter mile long. Using the handbrake launch, it gets a very slow 16-second quarter mile. Believe it or not, it's actually 2 seconds slower in this test than the Squatty, so unfortunately that gives it a 4 out of 10 for this test. Added all together, and the off-road capability score is 66.5 out of 100, which honestly isn't all that great. If we compare it to all the vehicles from the off-road class I've tested so far, that places it here in 22nd place, right between the Brawler and the Meriwether Mesa. Now, if we compare it to all the vehicles I've tested so far from all the different classes, including SUVs, etc., that places it here in 27th place out of the 42 vehicles I've tested so far, right between the regular Patriot and the Yuka Classic 4x4. So overall, the Mil-Spec, I honestly thought it would perform a lot better than it did, and if we compare the numbers here, I mean, it performs slightly better than the regular Patriot and is nowhere near the off-road capability of the Squatty, which does pretty much everything better in terms of off-roading. So that's something you definitely have to consider when buying one of these. The Mil-Spec cost about $1.7 million for its normal price, and just under $1.3 million for its trade price, which is definitely very expensive. But it does offer a brand new exclusive interior, amazing customization, and of course the Imani tech options as well. It's not the best off-roader, unfortunately, but I still think it's a very cool truck with great customization that at least does off-road decently. But again, if you're looking for the ultimate Humvee in game for off-roading, that would still be the old Squatty. Well, that's it guys, hope you enjoyed the video. Again, if you'd like to see the other videos on the other vehicles I've tested so far and how the Mammoth Patriot Mil-Spec compares to all the other ones, I will leave a link to the playlist down below in the pinned comment as well, and the spreadsheet which will contain the most updated breakdown and scores for all vehicles in one place. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll see you next year.